Hi everyone, welcome back to another lecture. Last time we finished our second PowerPoint by discussing seasoning and how the slaves were trained in order to be slaves. Something that a lot of people, I guess, don't realize that, like you just don't, you're not born knowing how to work on a plantation, right? You have to be trained. You have to have your name and your culture stripped away, learn English, and you need to establish some dynamics with your master, right? Because the masters needed to maintain their sense of authority over the slaves using fear and torture and things like that in order for the institution to continue. We also began discussing several states and how they handled slavery. First, Maryland and Virginia, aka the Chesapeake, that largely acquired slaves during times of economic prosperity in countries like England, where they got a lot of indentured servants from, right? Because they needed the slaves to work their tobacco plantations. We also discussed the Carolinas, where South Carolina, specifically Charlestown or Charleston today, was one of the largest and most profitable slave cities in America, right? It was specifically planned for that. So today we're going to cover several more states and maybe continue a tiny bit more next time, but discuss other topics next time too. So largely today what I mean is we're going to mostly finish out talking about the individual states. Okay. So let's begin by discussing New England. In New England, slaves and free blacks made up much less of the population than in Charlestown, as New Englanders primarily had human farming. Human farming essentially means that you do it yourself, right? So these white planters own their own land and they would farm it with their families, right? That's traditionally what we think about with farmers, right? That's why farmers have a lot of kids, so that their kids could be little workers helping the family. This is mostly with smaller planters, because if you have a large plantation, like you're not going to have a big enough family to farm it by yourselves, right? So this indicates to us that New England had quite a bit of small farmers. The Puritans codified, which means officially put into law, slavery by 1641. So Puritans, for those of you who don't know, are a branch of Christianity, and they essentially mean that they feel that the Bible, whether Christian or Catholic, that people don't obey it to the T, right? They don't obey it word for word. Puritans believe that they obey the Bible verbatim, right? Meaning that they practice the religion in its purest form. Okay, and they were heavily persecuted in Europe, so that's why they came to the United States. The Massachusetts Royal Colony went even further by passing the Body of Liberties, which prohibited slavery in some instances but legally allowed it based on 4 conditions. And here are the 4. 1. The slaves were captives of war. Remember, we talked about the transatlantic slave trade and how that was true most of the time, so that's sort of a given. 2. They were purchased elsewhere. So, meaning that somebody bought them, say, in Charlestown or Charleston, and brought them to New England, that's fine. 3, they sold themselves into slavery, right? I'm kind of going out of order, but meaning that the slaves maybe had debts and they couldn't pay off the debt, so they volunteered to be slaves, right? It's sort of like a theme, right? A lot of cultures too, like if a husband gambled all his money away or owed a lot of debt in general, then their wives would sell themselves into prostitution in order to pay off the debt for their husband, right? So it's, that tends to happen. Not so much with the African slaves, though. Or they were sentenced to slavery, right? Again, for crimes, which the first and last points are essentially what the African slave trade did, right? War and crime would get you a slavery sentence in a lot of cases. So this is sort of like using already systems that are already in place in order to justify their owning of slaves. They also used the word strangers to refer to Native Americans and African slaves because they were not considered to be British subjects. So there's that othering, right? If you treat people as other, it's easier for you to see yourself above them, right? Um, Although, ironically, they put out pictures like this, right? It says, work and be happy. The slaves are happy to be there, right? Just to make people feel better about it. So if you take a look at video A, here is an audio reading of the Body of Liberties. So you don't have to listen to all of it, just listen to enough to get a general idea of what it was about, okay? It's in old colonial language. Here is a New England slave auction. So like I mentioned before, sometimes the slaves were sold off ship, like you can see here, and they were put on top of pretty much anything, right? These slaves are standing on top of a barrel, and the auctioneer is right there ready to sell them. They don't even know what's going on, really. So I previously mentioned that Central Park, New York was one of the biggest slave markets in America. So let's talk about New York and New Jersey. First of all, did you guys know that New York and New Jersey were called New Netherlands, right? The original owners of these colonies were the Dutch, who are from the Netherlands. So New York was originally New Amsterdam, and not New York. It became New York and New Jersey when the British took it over from the Dutch. So this video that you can see at the top is video B, and this is a tour that one guy is doing of slavery in New York, sort of pointing out different areas where the slaves were sold or docked or what have you. Just so you can see. There's another guy too who does tours of New York, showing the different points of New Amsterdam, right? When the Dutch owned it, what did these streets look like? What kind of buildings, like the Hudson River in New York, for example, is named after a Dutch explorer. So a lot of history in there. Slavery began in present-day New York with the Dutch West India Company, who used 11 African slaves in 1625 as farmers, fur traders, and builders in order to form New Amsterdam as the capital of the New Netherlands. Okay. So the Dutch West India Company was one of the biggest traders in the world. You probably heard of the East India Company, largely run by the British in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, right? The West India Company was essentially the Dutch's company to go and get spices from places like India and China in the Middle East. And now they've expanded. They wanted to expand to America and get into the fur trade that the French were doing, which we'll talk about, and trade some of our resources as well. The colony encompassed much of New York and New Jersey. Unlike the colonies that we just discussed, African slaves maintained a few basic rights, and black families were generally kept together. They were married in churches by ministers of the Dutch Reformed Church, who were the Protestants. The Protestants are another branch of Christianity, and they often fought with the Catholics, especially in England. And their children could be baptized in the church. African slaves could also sign legal documents, testify in court, and bring civil actions against white colonists. Now, all of these things were illegal in the British colonies. Those who were paid for their work were able to work overtime, allowing them to make almost the same wages as white workers. Now, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, if they're slaves, how are they getting paid? Good question, right? So sometimes slaves in general be paid on the side, like either they craft things and sell them at markets. George Washington had some of his slaves do this, or did extra side jobs that the master lent them out for, right? But they were still enslaved because they were forcibly working, right? Their life was controlled. They could not leave. They couldn't start their own life, right? So economically, they weren't slaves by doing that, but in general, they were still slaves because they couldn't leave. Right? When the Dutch colonies became British in the 1660s, so New York and New Jersey came about pretty quickly. The Dutch made sure to free all of their slaves, which kickstarted free black communities in the area. So, pretty good, right? Like, your family didn't last generations if you were part of the Dutch colonies, you were free. However, because the British continued to import slaves, by 1703, more than 42% of New York's homes had slaves in them, second only to Charlestown's numbers. And we'll talk about big cities and what slavery looked like in those cities later on. So here's a picture of an auction in New Netherlands. Okay, large crowd. You can't really see what the slave is standing on. This other guy's standing on a barrel trying to see what's happening, and this other guy's looking right at us. It's kind of creepy. But yeah, so the Dutch were a lot more humane than the British. As we'll talk about later, what the British kept slavery going on for so long is because they took away a lot of these things, right? Getting the right to get married, the right to sign legal documents, the right to sue. All these things they took away so that they could keep slavery for generations to come. And here's a picture of New Amsterdam. You can see a couple of Dutch people, and you can see some African slaves working in the background. So slavery is slavery no matter how nicely they treat you, obviously. But compared to England, the Dutch were way better about it. So now let's talk about New France. Okay, so the French actually, they had their colony from New Orleans to Quebec, Canada. So it was huge, right? We purchased New France as a Louisiana territory, the Louisiana Purchase, if you want to call it, in 1803 through Thomas Jefferson, buying it from Napoleon of France, okay, for $15 million, which is quite a steal for all that land. So in New France, the reason why they came over here is for the fur trade, right? Beavers, foxes, all that stuff. That's what the French excelled in, right? The British colonists and the French colonists would get in quite a bit of conflicts with each other because they hated each other in general. They've been fighting each other for thousands of years because Britain used to own France, and France hates Britain for that, right? But let's talk about what slavery was like there. Slavery mainly culminated near the Great Lakes, right, and over by Illinois and Michigan and all those places, and the Mississippi River. And of course, in French Caribbean colonies like Saint Domingue, which was renamed Haiti. More slaves were imported for agricultural and mining uses for the Illinois region when the New Orleans port was established in 1718. By the mid-18th century, slaves accounted for 1/3 of the population. Sugarcane plantations were erected along the Mississippi River, and slavery was maintained through both the French and Spanish occupations. By 1724, slavery was regulated in the French colonies through Louis XIV's Code Noir, which, like the Dutch, gave slaves the right to marry. Louis XIV was a very well-known, I guess, popular kind of French king, right? And he's the one who built the Palace of Versailles. If you've never seen Versailles before, it's stunning, very rich, a lot of gold. You know, I've been there. That's where Marie Antoinette lived, right? Although corporal punishment was legal under these laws, under certain conditions, torture was forbidden. So corporal punishment means, like, you know, the worst kind of punishment. Like, you could potentially kill your slaves. But they didn't like unnecessary torture. You can see from this picture there are some slaves being brought off of boats. Slave masters also could not separate married couples or young children from their mothers. Masters were also required to convert their slaves to Catholicism, which implied that African slaves were human beings with savable souls, right? That's what the Catholic religion believes. And the French were very heavily Catholic. Although the codes forbade interracial marriage, interracial relationships had already been going on for years in Louisiana. So that's where we get the Creoles, right? We talked about that. Like a lot of Creoles were either Spanish or French origin. Okay. In New Orleans, concubines were normalized through a system called pocage, which was also seen in the Spanish colonies. Primarily formed between African or African American women and young white men, concubines were acquired under contracts, which provided the following: freedom for the woman and her children, education for any mixed race children they may have, and property settlements, meaning that she gets her own property when the contract is finished. This picture you can see here is of a concubine. So basically, she was used for sex and companionship. In New France, free people of color became the middle of the social caste between European settlers and enslaved Africans, meaning they're basically like the middle class, is what we understand now. Free blacks were able to work in artisan trades, meaning that they could train to do things like wig making, blacksmithing, tailoring, things like that, and could be educated and own property. Contrastly, in Virginia, the term slavery became an umbrella term for all peoples of African descent, regardless if they were free or not. Okay, so the French were a little bit more liberal in the fact that they actually paid attention to the differences between black people and recognized them, right? Whereas in the British colonies, they sort of treated all black people like crap, basically. We'll talk about like the food that came out of the Creoles in New Orleans and some of this culture as well a little bit later. If you take a look at video C, this is a video exploring colorism with Creoles. Now, colorism is very rampant still in the black community and in other communities of color. Essentially, colorism is prizing a certain skin tone over others. So many cultures pride lighter skin tones and Eurocentric features over darker skin tones. And that's an issue, right? Because if you're fighting within your own community and judging each other for the color of your skin, which you can't control, that creates a lot of division and unfairness and all that stuff. So there's talking about Creoles and how they were often held up to a higher standard than darker skinned slaves or free blacks. Okay. So here are some New Orleans slaves. One has a violin. Our last topic is Florida, which originally was owned by Spain. Now, for a long time, Spain sort of had Florida, right, surrounded by British colonies, right? They had Florida, they had South America, several Caribbean islands, and they had the West Coast until Mexico took it over. Right? New Spain, of course, was, just to give you background, largely discovered by the conquistadors, which were professional soldiers and warriors who basically raped and pillaged ancient cultures and Native Americans looking for gold and silver and various riches. Okay. If you're interested in learning more about those types of things, I'd encourage you to take a Mexican American history course. Maybe you'll learn some more about that. Or if you find a Spanish course in college about Spain, I haven't seen one, but or if you read a book about it, So, New Spain in Florida was founded by 1513. Because there weren't that many Spanish settlers, they purchased very few slaves. However, they did grant freedom to escapees from South Carolina and Georgia in an attempt to destabilize the English colonies. So Spain hated England too, right? They have a long history. I kind of went over a little bit. Queen Elizabeth the First and her beef with Philip II of Spain and the Spanish Armada, right? Mainly because England was largely Protestant and Spain was Catholic, and they hated that England turned their back on the Catholic Church when Henry VIII left the Catholic Church in order to marry his second wife. So it's like a long history of this. And so that's why Spain allowed the slaves who ran away from South Carolina and Georgia to settle there, right? Because it pissed off the British, right? A lot of different countries would do stuff specifically to piss off the British. Next time we're going to talk about a rebellion that actually happened so that the slaves could run away to Spain. So that we'll talk about that next time. Going a step further, if the runaway slaves converted to Catholicism and agreed to serve in Spanish militias, aka little military units, they could even become Spanish citizens. In 1730, the free black settlement of Fort Mose was established, or Fort Mose, it's been called both. The only one in the South that was sponsored by a European colonial government, Spain. So free black settlements, just to clarify, were largely left on their own. The black people had to figure out how to basically live by themselves, right? Make their own life in America, because they maybe didn't necessarily have the means to get back to Africa, or they didn't want to go back to Africa, so they just established their own settlement. So Spain actually supported this fort. This maroon settlement acted as a frontline defense against British attacks from the north and was settled by the runaways from the British colonies. If you take a look at video D, you'll see more info about Fort Mose or Mose, whatever you want to call it. With around 100 settlers, the settlement was led by Francisco Menendez, an African slave from Gambia who escaped from the Carolinas. And here he is pictured in his military gear. Menendez also worked as a captain of the slave militia, receiving distinguishments after thwarting a British attack in 1728. So the British did attempt to take down this fort several times. The settlement was enclosed by a wall with houses, a church, and an earthen fort inside. And we'll see a picture of that next. So this is what the fort looked like back in the day, right? As you can see, they have fields outside of it, growing their own crops. It's not very big because there's only 100 settlers, but that's kind of what Jamestown was like. Jamestown wasn't that big. And here's the fort today. So that's it for today. I know it feels kind of short. So next time, as I mentioned, we're going to discuss that rebellion that happened. We're also going to talk about when the British took over Florida, and we're going to talk about one more state. And I believe we're also going to discuss gender as well. So how women were treated in slavery, what their jobs were, and how they were taken advantage of, because it's a very serious topic. Okay, so I hope you guys are enjoying the lecture so far, and please let me know if you have any questions.